Hello?
Caroline, could you press your play slideshow button, please? Your attendees can see your screen.
Please, I've just done that.
Yeah, if you could press play slideshow and then you're welcome to start presenting.
I have just done that. So if you don't see the slides, I don't know what can be done.
There we go. That's fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. Please feel free to present.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Anne, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are around the world. I'm Caroline Sapriel. I'm the managing partner of CS&A International. We are a global risk, crisis, and business continuity management firm operating since 1991 around the world, working with multinationals across industry sectors. So today my session is really focusing on crisis leadership, which is sorely needed across industries around the world when we look at the number of crises and the lack of crisis leadership that is endemic in most of the crises that we see today. So I will take you through a number of things that I believe with 30 years experience in the field are critical to this topic. And feel free to ask your questions. I will leave maybe 10 minutes at the end to address the questions that anyone might have. And hopefully you find this interesting. You can revisit the slideshow because it's being recorded later on. But if you would like to contact me for some specifics or follow-up or questions that you might have afterwards, you can do so by email directly. Because this slide pack is not available for download. So I hope you find this interesting and that it brings food for thought for all of you. And I'm going to get started. So I want to really emphasize the difference between crises and reputation train wrecks. This is the crux of what's happening today. A lot of organizations are extremely well prepared for crises, and yet when something happens, somehow it still ends up in a reputation meltdown or a reputation train wreck, whichever expression you prefer to use. So I'm going to talk about that and why that is and how we can prevent that train wreck. We're going to clarify the difference between crisis management and crisis leadership, introduce the basic core crisis leadership competencies, and review what it takes for leaders to develop crisis leadership with these competencies that are really different from, managing a bad week at the office. So let's get started. And to get started, really, I want to set the scene and make sure that everybody's aligned on what is a crisis. But first, what is important is to look at how organizations are prepared today. Having been in this field for 30 years, I've seen quite a lot of progress. The progress seems to be more obvious in certain industries than others for a combination of things, either because they're more high-risk industries or more regulated and need to be better prepared, or because the company culture is such that the leadership wants to be prepared, or just sheerly out of a legacy and just time evolving and a realization that organizations need to be more mature in this field. So, modeling on a Shell research that was done in the 90s, we kind of adopted or adapted this approach and modeled a crisis management culture ladder, which states 5 levels, and I think I'm going to leave that with you to consider whether you feel your organization is at any particular level. The majority, in my experience today, is anywhere between the calculative and proactive, the smaller organization, less high risks, perhaps a little bit lower. What is interesting is that recently my firm, we conducted a global survey on crisis preparedness, and the majority of respondents were experienced either crisis managers, business continuity managers, or risk managers. And their response indicated that they felt their organization was well prepared. I do put a question on that in the sense that it is normal that the crisis owners feel that their organization is well prepared because it's their duty, their scope of work, their mandate to make sure that their organization is well prepared. However, the reality is not always that way. So even though the organization has a designated crisis custodian, it doesn't necessarily imply that the organization is well prepared. So I put a caveat on this. But I leave this chart for you to consider, and we can talk about it at the end if anybody has a particular question. So to set the scene, let's really look at what is a crisis. A crisis needs three components to be a crisis, and it really doesn't matter whether it's an explosion, a major fire, a plane crash, a cyber attack, or literally an ethics or behavior or fraud case. It needs three components. It needs surprise, oh my God, something's happened. It needs to be addressed immediately. It cannot be left for the following day or next week. And of course, there's a threat, and there's a threat to a combination of things or either of any of these areas. First and foremost, people's lives, environment, assets, business, stock price, just viability of the business, operating license, and so on. Or really in the worst type of crises, and those that often end up in a reputation meltdown, is of course a combination of all these threat areas. Now, over the years, I've used the same base definition of what is a crisis. And I think today, and I've been using this definition for the past 27 years. Actually, today it's ever more appropriate because a crisis can really be an event. It could be a revelation. Obviously, we think of Volkswagen, as a major example of that. It could be an allegation. There's enough of those around. It could be a set of circumstances that forced your company having an incident to all of a sudden find itself in crises because the circumstances make it so much more topical, so much more of interest, and raises so much more outrage. Obviously, the threat is to the integrity, the reputation, the survival. It could be an individual, it could be an organization. Sometimes one is both or both. In whatever situation, when we're in crisis, the public is basically saying, I don't like you, I don't like what you stand for, I don't feel safe with you, I don't think you behave appropriately. Therefore, there's a real rejection of the public vis-a-vis or the stakeholder groups vis-a-vis the organization involved. Of course, what distinguishes a crisis from a major emergency or an incident is obviously that there is no control. So you may have control of the actual incident, but the scope and the stakeholder pressure is such that you have no control over the way it is being perceived, and therefore we border into the reputation threat, reputation meltdown potential, reputation train wreck potential. Now, there's enough examples around, and I picked a few here, which are really, you will have all, I'm sure, know about, have seen, have followed more or less closely. What is interesting is that we're talking about a real globalized situation. Globalization brings in systemic risks, as you've seen, but globalization with social networks and the internet all of a sudden brings crises to all corners of the world. The H&M case with the little boy and the sweatshirt that H&M created as the coolest monkey in the jungle obviously caused a major crisis in South Africa with rampage in the stores, demonstrations, potential violence, and so on. What really was initiated as a silly marketing mistake done somewhere by H&M, who thought it would be fun to put a little black boy modeling for this type of sweatshirt. Obviously completely inappropriate in the circumstances of today's outrage towards discrimination, racism, etc. Facebook has obviously highlighted that area as well, especially in the context of the GDPR. That has gotten huge traction. The fact that Cambridge Analytica was not a new case. In fact, it's a German publication that broke the story more than 2 years ago. It was picked up by The Guardian in the UK and then finally got complete traction across news media 3 years ago because 2 months ago or just about. And it got huge traction around the world because Facebook is Facebook. It's causing a real trust issue. A real rejection of certain parts of social networks. So one event is catapulting the whole, or causing into question the whole trustworthiness of social networks. Harvey Weinstein is another type of crisis, has to do with another type of outrage, which is very much on the news right now. Of course, cyber is there. And then, of course, we have KFC, which is there a crisis that really could have been prevented. I mean, the company's mission is to deliver chicken, and if you decide you're going to change logistic partners, then obviously build contingencies. Having said that, that crisis from a communications point of view was well handled, even if I put a caveat that it was really well handled and would be appropriate in a UK self-deprecating, humorous environment. I'm not sure that that approach would have worked in all cultures. So plenty of examples abound. Every day we turn on the news and we know that it just keeps going. So public outrage drives crises. The hot issues that we are seeing right now and that keep pushing things forward is obviously any form of discrimination, migration, gender inequality, sexual harassment, privacy, big data, the treatment of animals, the environment, that's not new, but it keeps getting more and more traction, food safety and food security, the overall topic of the big bad company taking advantage of the small organization, small corner of the street business that's going out of business because the big bad company is doing whatever it's doing, and so on. Those are the main topics. And I think most of the crises we see today refer in one way or another to some sort of issue that drives public outrage. In other words, we don't need an event, but we have the context of the outrage that is catapulting smaller incidents or any incident to crisis level. So to the surprise of a lot of people, actually the majority of crises today in, I would say, the developed world are smoldering. This is not the main event. By and large, safety standards are much better. Accidents still do happen, but it's the smoldering events that seem to get most of the attention. And smoldering, the source of smoldering crises, actually these crises can go on for quite a while internally, either undetected or unreported or kept under wraps or ignored, or complacency sets in, therefore we think we can handle it, and then something happens, a trigger, a flashpoint, and then all of a sudden that smoldering problem becomes a full-blown crisis. The origin of most crises today seems to lie with management, as you can see on the right-hand chart, with a huge percentage is either, again, complacency, negligence, deliberate cover-up, ignorance, or whatever other problem that can lie at that level. So this is interesting. What is interesting, what I find fascinating, is that if 71%, so say 70% of crises are smoldering, that means by and large, 70% of crises, if you do your homework and your risk and your threat management properly, the majority of these crises could be prevented. That's good news, I think, as long as you do the work. A lot of organizations still have a hard time working on the risk and the threats, the pre-crisis phase, because a lot of that is abstract. And there is still a sense of, oh, it's not going to happen to us. So that sets the scene for crises today. What is interesting is that there's a number of common themes and factors here. First of all, we've got globalizations and systemic risks. That is not new. It's been like this for quite a while. Every crisis gets politicized much more than it ever used to be. Climate is having a huge impact, not only on the immediate repercussions of that in terms of emergency response and disaster response, but actually on supply chains across different product or business categories. If we recall the ash cloud of 2010 in Europe, that was obviously a complete disruption of air traffic. That had a huge impact on all sorts of businesses down their supply chain. The floods in Thailand had a huge impact on the price of the chip for the computer industry. The same with the auto industry, took a huge beating because the amount of concentration of manufacturing that takes place. So climate has a huge impact on business and not just from an emergency response point of view on people's lives. We have had breaking news and 24-hour cable news since '84. I was around when that transition took place. It was huge. Now it's part of daily lives. On top of that, we've got the internet, which means that the news cycles are blurred. It's all 24/7. And of course, now for quite a few years, we've got social networks, and that is really having the ultimate impact of bringing all stakeholders close to the scene, or in close attention to the problem that the crisis or any crisis is raising. So the result of these themes and factors is that crises are getting compounded. We're getting into the phase of what I call Uber crises. They're getting more complex. They must be managed on multi levels, multi dimensions. It's making interfaces to manage crises for different teams managing crises very, very challenging. And in my experience, failures in the interface between teams is often what actually makes or breaks the crisis, and renders it very difficult to resolve because there are gaps. A lot of people, of course, are now talking about fake news. Fake news have always existed. It is not new. It just seems to be worse because of obviously the internet, social networks, etc., etc. Here is an example of a French, very large industrial groups, which if we have French people in the audience, they will know very well. This is an example of a press release that was received by main professional media news organizations, was not verified, was entirely fake, was published by these news organizations, and obviously made the stock plunge because it was completely fake. So there is a problem with the fake news and the impact that it has today because of the world we live in. However, there's a little glimmer of hope. And I think instead of talking about media and social media, I think we should start talking about platform versus real journalism. The good news is that journalism, the real journalism, is on the rise. In fact, a lot of the quality publications are getting increased readerships, and hopefully we're going to see a little bit more of that. So I think that this report, which is really quite recent, is very encouraging for hopefully more and more people being able to make the difference between what they get on social networks and what they get when they really read or listen to or watch quality news organization reports. So let's summarize. What is a crisis and what is a reputation train wreck? When a crisis, potential impact is huge. It can be difficult to resolve. It can last a long time. But ultimately, stakeholder trust is retained and reputation can actually even be enhanced through the actions and decisions of the organization that's impacted. In a train wreck scenario, we also have severe impacts. It can be also very difficult to solve. It can last a long time, but the credibility is jeopardized, the trust is broken, and basically the organization may never recover. Some of the bigger crises that have taken place in the last decade are really in that category. And I think, of course, of the BP Transocean Gulf of Mexico crisis. I think of Volkswagen. I think of quite a few others where basically the public and stakeholders are saying, we don't believe you, we don't have any confidence in your organization, and it's a complete reputation meltdown. In some cases, particularly in the financial industry, some of these organizations just don't recover. They get rebranded, renamed, they get bought, and there's enough examples of that. So I think the objective of any crisis team and senior leadership in a crisis is not to try and necessarily fix the crisis, because sometimes you can't. It's to recognize that it's a bad time. It's going to last whatever cycle of time it's going to last. And if anything, the only thing we can protect is our credibility and our stakeholder trust. And all efforts should be in there. So in today's crises, the stakeholder component, and I would qualify that as stakeholder mapping, and the management of perceptions of stakeholders is possibly the most important, the most critical aspects that senior leaders can pay attention to and focus on. Even if they can't control all stakeholders, in fact, it's a false assumption, it's a fallacy for leaders to imagine that they can influence all stakeholders. They certainly should focus on the ones where they feel there's room to have an impact, and all focus should be on that. However, the stakeholder mapping and the retention of stakeholder trust is a slightly more intense exercise in a crisis than it is in a day-to-day. If I talk to most of our client organizations, they will say that they have a stakeholder mapping system and that it works very well. And then I see what they have in place, and it's quite a slow process. It doesn't take into account the time pressures and the different risks that a crisis brings. And therefore, stakeholder mapping in a crisis calls for something completely different, something that needs to be trained in. It needs a model. And I will emphasize this a little bit further on. But the one variable of crises today is stakeholder trust and credibility. You may not be liked, but if you're still believed, you have a chance to come out in one piece. So it's interesting that crisis management is called crisis management because the very nature of crises is that we can't control them. So I always found that quite a point to reflect on. Crises bring a lot of uncertainty. They typically get worse before they get better. Being in a crisis is a little bit like being on a boat in a storm, or I like the analogy of the dark tunnel. You can't see anything. You don't know how long this tunnel is going to go on for. You don't know the bends. You don't know anything. And you don't know, how long you're going to be in it before you can get out. There is usually a way out. And that is that sort of light at the end of the tunnel that leadership teams need to focus on. That calls for one particular area of competency, of crisis leadership competency, which is called sense making. It's the ability to give mission to a crisis, how we should be perceived at the end game when we come out of that dark tunnel by our stakeholders. The bad news is that most of us will not have enough time in a crisis. We're never going to have enough information. We may not have enough people or resources. It's a well-known fact that crises are extremely labor-intensive. Things are going to get worse before they get better. We're really going to be blamed, whether it's justified or not. We're going to have a lot of opposition, and we're going to a lot of pressure. So this is the reality, and steering the way through the crisis is perhaps a better way to define and describe what the mission should be of senior leaders in a crisis, rather than the assumption that they can manage the crisis. I think steering the course, steering the way is a more appropriate approach. It's a fact that leadership in a crisis is different from leadership in day-to-day. Day-to-day management teams like to work with consensus. Makes sense, because the more buy-in we have for any decision, the more it is now proven that the result will be most effective. In a crisis, we don't have time for this. It's a more command and control approach where one leader, one person needs to make decisions, even often under, with limited information. So somebody has to take the risks, and the buck stops with that one individual or that one, or that one person or that one team. We don't have many role models of crisis leaders. There are more role models of general leadership today. And the perception generally by employees and teams is that the leader that leads by command and control is not democratic. He is a dictator. He does not allow for comments and input, where actually in a crisis there is not much choice. It is a little bit like a military or an army, rigor and control. However, trained teams that are really well trained, senior teams, recognize that there is room for input. That input should be provided to the leader for him to make the best possible decisions. But fundamentally, the crisis leader is one that doesn't wait for agreement among all his fellow team members. At some point, he will just have to make the decision. So I think that's the main difference, and it's important to remind everyone and to actually educate team members that the management style changes dramatically in a crisis, and that everybody should be ready for it and accept it. We have developed a PAIR concept already quite a few years ago, which reminds organizations where the priorities are in a crisis. People always come first. There's no situation where people don't come first. And I've listed a few examples on the right in that list. It doesn't have to be injuries or fatalities. It could also be in labor issues. It could be in product contaminations. It could be in any situation. People always come first. Environment second, then assets. And if you do things in that order, only then can you protect your reputation. You will never be able to protect or enhance reputation in a crisis if you put your assets, your bottom line first. You will be judged very badly. And that's why this order is here to remind management teams that whatever happens, whatever compromise they need to make, they can never compromise people, and they need to follow that order. Here is a list. I'm just taking a sip of water. Here is a list of the fundamental 8. There are more, but there are crisis leadership competencies that we have developed and we've worked on. In fact, there is some work in the academic sector on this, but a lot of these things are soft skills. Therefore, they're not always taken into account when we talk about training our senior teams. People say, oh, well, we have crisis training, we have crisis exercise, except the assumption is that these people are experienced, therefore they know how to behave in a crisis. Well, I would suggest otherwise. I don't think managing a crisis is like managing a bad week at the office. It takes special skills. These skills need to be introduced to senior leaders. And it's not because these senior leaders have 25 years experience in the business that by default they make good crisis leaders. And we have ample examples to make this point. And it takes training, it takes a recognition that certain skills need to be honed in. And those are the 8 that I chose to list here as priorities. Now, because real crises are rare, then if we wait for these crises to actually provide an opportunity to be trained, actually this is not going to work. So we need to have regular training at a high level, at all levels in the organization, but at a high level it's a more challenging one because people do feel, I've got the experience, I've been in this business for so long, I've been in crisis teams, I know what to do. But in fact, how do you know that they know what to do unless they are actually tested in a real crisis? But if real crises are rare, then how do you verify that these individuals on these teams are actually crisis leadership competent? So there's got to be a framework to provide individuals that people can take with them when they move to different teams or different locations in the organization, that they've developed a crisis competency matrix and profile that can go with them and that can contribute to different locations when they are moved or they take a different job. The best crisis teams are made on the basis of suitability and not functionality alone. So over and over again, I see crisis teams made up of HR and legal and IT and operations and marketing and communications, and those functions are all fine and they all need to be there. But the really mature organization really look at beyond the functionality, but rather the adaptability of these individuals and their able to withstand stress, their ability to withstand stress, to operate under stress, to recognize what crisis leadership priorities they have in front of them when they've got very limited information to make decisions on. So it takes a different level of suitability beyond the functionality, functional expertise. And it takes training to build these reflexes. But training alone without articulating the competencies is falling short, I believe, of what is needed today. I remember that when the tsunami in Japan occurred and TEPCO, the Japanese electric company, was so criticized in the media because of their handling of the situations. And actually a few of our clients even commented on this. And I was quite quick to stop people and I said, come on, are you really fit to manage and a nuclear accident and a tsunami and a nuclear accident at the same time? I don't think CEOs are ready for that. I don't think senior leaders are ready for that level of stress. The fact is, this poor man had a stroke 6 weeks later. Of course, he could have been better trained in media training and in communication to understand that different stakeholders of different cultures will put different pressures. That's a given. But fundamentally, I don't believe that there's many leaders that are trained for that level of criticality, stress, and inability to provide any answers to the people most affected by it for days. So I always remind people to be a little bit humble and recognize that it does take a special set of skills to be able to manage a real crisis. The stakeholder management or the stakeholder trust really depends on the organization recognizing that there's two views of the crisis. There is the internal operational view of the team and what it sees that it believes it is doing to manage the crisis, and the external perceptual view of the situation by stakeholders. If those two views, and here they're represented by two circles, are far apart, we have a great chance of moving from a crisis to a reputation train wreck. So if anything, keeping that image in mind and making sure that those two circles are close to each other really gives the organization the best chance to actually manage and protect its reputation in a crisis. So the crisis remains a crisis and doesn't become a reputation train wreck. I've used this image for many years to make clients and teams understand that it's not because you're managing the crisis that you are by default the expert on the way the crisis is perceived. In fact, after a while, it's a well-known fact that crisis teams tend to get a navel-gazing, a belly button approach and go into a siege, and they think that whatever they're doing is working. So the external perceptual view is an absolute cross-check factor that needs to be taken into account if the organization is going to protect its reputation. The common mistakes are to play ostrich, treat the media like the enemy, be reactive versus proactive, use language the audiences or stakeholders do not understand. It can be anything from being too technical or insensitivity to certain end uses, the words, the tones is wrong. Not listening to stakeholders, so there is the perceptual intake. So do we really know how and what we are doing, whether what we are doing is perceived the way that we want it to be perceived? Assume that truth and fact and science will triumph overall, where there's plenty of examples where that's not the case, because emotions are a reality in crises. And these emotions must be taken into account, even if they're not corresponding to facts and truth. The bigger the gap between emotions and truth, the bigger the problem is. And turning off the valve, putting out the fire is not going to help. It's only going to solve the current problem. It is definitely not going to solve the crisis. In fact, if there is a gap, the problem will become much worse. So addressing only issues and ignoring feelings is a common mistake, and one that I see repeated over and over again. Let's talk a little bit about the stakeholder mapping approach, which is so critical in a crisis. Unfortunately, people they say they know how to map stakeholders, and very often what I see is a list of stakeholders. Well, great, so you have a list, and then what do you do with that list? Mapping means that you have to understand where these stakeholders are in their positions vis-a-vis your organization, vis-a-vis the issue at hand in the crisis, whether the stakeholders have conflicting agendas. Which side are they on? Are they on your side? Are they against you? Are they neutral? And if they are neutral, could they shift? A simple way to explain this is assume you have just made an investment in a particular commune or locality or town where you're going to build a huge extension to a plant, or in fact, you're building a new plant. So the mayor is going to be delighted. You're providing employment. You're going to be a good citizen. You're adding economy to the city. There's going to be a lot of upbeat and a lot of positivity attached to this. However, if 6 months after the opening, your plant has a major fire, the first person to turn against you, because at the end of the day, you're not important to him, the first person is going to be that mayor, because the only thing that interests him is his constituency and his political party. So even if he is not outright against you from the start, he will be watching and being neutral until he can see that you're going to fix the problem or that you have a solution that will satisfy his electorate. So stakeholders shift very quickly, and it's the ones who shift that you can't anticipate shifting, and actually you can if you think about this and if you build worst case scenarios. They're the ones that you have to monitor mostly. You cannot influence everyone. In fact, that's a recognition that needs to be made for everybody on the team. If you're an oil and gas company, trying to influence Greenpeace in the middle of an oil spill is going to be very challenging. So and virtually impossible. So by all means, monitor Greenpeace and the NGOs, but don't expect that you're going to have any form of influence over what they say, because they've got their own agenda. Equally, working with government, I often see government or regulators as one of the stakeholders listed. Where government is made up of many different departments, many different ministries, different parts of regulators, and those regulators in these different departments and ministries often have conflicting agendas on this crisis. So therefore, the ability to map and see where you stand and therefore steer the course through this map is your best bet. That's something that senior teams need to learn to do. It is a lot more than just making a list. However, with a system and an approach, and we have developed a fast-track mapping, stakeholder mapping methodology and model that we use during crises and during training with our clients. With a methodology, it's incredible how quickly you can actually steer the course through the ones where you can have some sort of influence, and it empowers the team to shape potentially the outcome of the situation. So the most, like I said, the main variable of crises today is stakeholders, and the biggest task for crisis management teams is the mapping of stakeholders. Without mapping stakeholders, you don't have a chance to be able to steer the course. And therefore, with stakeholder maps, you can also build worst case scenarios. I mean, scenario planning in a crisis is pretty much broken up in 4 categories. 1, the fire gets worse. It's obvious. That's an easy one to envisage. The second one could be that the fire is out, but of the 3 injuries at the hospital, 2 days later, 2 actually died. So therefore, the impact or the consequence of this situation worsens it even if the fire is out. The third one, which is the one that's harder to grasp, but with a proper methodology and stakeholder mapping, teams have a chance of really building scenarios, is to envisage where the actions, where the influence, where the pressure might come from different stakeholder groups that may actually inflame, escalate the situation. And finally, of course, complacency, indecision, negligence, cover-ups, and or wrong decisions can actually, by management in the crisis, can of course worsen the situation. So these are 4 main categories. Now let's move on a little bit about dealing with the media in a crisis, because obviously it's a very important part, even if social media is important, and I will talk a little bit about social media. Fundamentally, the media is the vehicle to stakeholders in great part. They have a lot of power. They have a need of information. So recognizing that is the first step. I think today, by and large, most organizations have some sort of media relations and media contacts that they maintain. Having those media contacts is the starting point. But in today's crisis, you need absolutely three things: speed, accuracy, and frequency. Speed is absolutely fundamental. So the holding statement, which states the holding position, needs to be out as soon as possible. And By that, I mean not only to the main media, but it needs to be on your website, if possible, sent to Twitter, which is a major source of information for journalists. Accuracy, only release things that you have verified. Even if you have to hold and send a second holding statement before you release the facts, do so. So frequency is the other one. It's better to repeat the same thing that you've already said than to leave a gap and not say anything until you have updated information. I've lived that directly and personally with a major air crash. The longer the gap in information, the longer the void without any form of communication, the more likely the press is going to go elsewhere, because fundamentally they need the information to write a story. If they go elsewhere to get the information, chances are it may not be as accurate as what they could have gotten from you. So 3 things, the fundamentals of a strategy of media relations in a crisis is own up. So it's your crisis, even if you're not guilty, if you haven't caused it, own up. The crisis is happening to you on your turf. So be responsible in your owning of the situation. Respond quickly, don't hide, and engage. All 3. You can choose how to engage, what level of engagement. Responding may mean that you're just sending a holding statement to begin with, before you investigate what's going on, before the rumor can be further checked, but don't hide. The more you hide, the more the perception will be that you're guilty. And indeed, it's not only facts, it's also messages about who you are. What are your values? What are your pledges? Can you walk the talk? A great example of an organization that's really done that recently is the Starbucks handling of the 2 customers that went to the toilets and were arrested. Remember the context of discrimination? So it's a hot issue to begin with. This was a terrible situation, but the CEO of Starbucks very quickly made a few pledges, closing down shops, running training programs, furthermore, opening the decision to actually open toilets to the public, which obviously opens up a whole raft of actions they need to look at in terms of hygiene and drug use and things like that. But they really walked the talk. And that, I think, is a great example. Often clients ask us, there's so many bad examples of crises. Can you come up with a good one? I think that is definitely a good one. Moving on to social media, which is not new. It was new a few years ago. People were paranoid. They were very scared of, what do we say? What do we do? First of all, if you have a social media problem, you can't fight it without social media water. That means you have to use the same channel. You cannot tell people, well, go to our website. That's not going to be enough. You have to post, even if it's only posting a holding statement and saying for more information, go visit our website, but you have to be there. Like the media, the more you have some sort of understanding, policy, and presence on social media, albeit it is going to be different if you're a B2C or B2B company. If you have some sort of presence, if you have some sort of familiarity with it, the chances that you'll be managing it better during a crisis is much higher. Whatever, even if there is the viral speed factor that everybody's scared of, don't knee-jerk react. Stop, think, and consider how you will respond. You also don't need to respond to every post. You can make a general post and then take certain conversations offline as much as possible. Social media doesn't work by itself. It needs to work with news media and traditional media channels. And if it doesn't, you're missing an opportunity. Don't forget, the media is that journalists do go to social media, especially Twitter, for their information. Therefore, it has to work hand in hand. It has to be managed. You need to be consistent in the message, but you need to adjust the tone. And I feel that in terms of closure, at the end of the crisis, there's no better network, there's no better environment than social media platforms. Of course, it's not just the media, it's also government. And government relations, just like media relations, are established before. So your ability to work with your GA person in-house, your government relations expert in-house, in the preparation and prevention and during a crisis is absolutely critical. You will need to know where the levers are, who to talk to, how to talk to, understand the different sensitivities between different ministries and departments to be able to influence if you can, or at least demonstrate transparency and retain credibility. If you lose the trust of key government players, it's going to be very hard. In fact, you could lose your very license to operate. So I can't emphasize enough that government is not just one bunch of one bag of people. It needs to be split. It needs to be looked into in details. Which individual, at what level, what have they said? And for that, you need a close relationship with your government affairs or government relations person if you have one in your organization, or if you use an external lobbying firm. To close, I want to pull it together before we break for questions. We created a model quite a while ago. The challenge today is that these things are very often handled in different parts of the organization. So companies have a risk management department that deals with risk, ERM, and all sorts of very complex approaches that very few people are privy to. And it tends to be kept into a very small group of people. It's not always cascaded down or goes across the different departments. It's been around for a long time, primarily a financial insurance instrument. Now, obviously, risk management goes into many different functions, from reputation risk to safety to operation to climate and things like that. So that's been around for quite a while. Emergency response and crisis management have been around for quite a few decades, starting with emergency response for high-risk industries. It is the reaction and the preparedness to the management of the loss at the time of the loss. And then, of course, the business continuity really came on the scene with 9/11. In fact, the term did not exist before that. And it was because we had something before us, Y2K, where things could go wrong and we could prepare for them. So business continuity, the ability to plan and prepare for failures and ability to have in place a number of contingencies that allow you to continue to operate, is obviously the post-loss. These three need to be integrated. If you really want to manage crises and manage risk, you need to pull them together. There is a great need for stakeholder management and communication throughout all phases, and whatever is learned in the post phase needs to be fed back into the pre-loss prevention anticipation phase of the work. Unfortunately, my impression is that it is not my impression, my assessment of today's organizations, that it is often not pulled together, and it sits in different departments and therefore not always as effective as it should be. Right, I will close now and leave you with our 10 commandments, for which we won an award a few years ago. And it recaps, the key points of trying to avoid this reputation train wreck and demonstrate crisis leadership, even in the worst adversity. First one, own up and communicate the problem early on. If you don't own up, the longer you last, the longer you drag it, the worse it's going to be, the more likely you'll be perceived as guilty, and after that, recovering is even more difficult. A crisis is a bad scene. It could last a day, it could last a month, it could last, like a BP case, 3 months, be in the limelight, and in fact occupy 22% of news networks in the United States for 120 days. The fact is, it's bad, so no amount of communications, PR, whatever is going to make something like this look good, except it's going to be bad for a while, and focus on retaining that stakeholder trust. Be prepared for the worst. In crises, things get worse before it gets better. So senior teams needs to continuously think of how much worse it's going to get. That is very, very powerful. It allows better preparation, a broadening of the mind, and better solutions in the middle of a crisis. People's safety is always first, and protecting credibility is another one, which I started with and I emphasize in the middle and at the end. It's not about Winnie Browning points. It's really about being believed, even if you're not liked. Provide mission, provide sense to this crisis. Without sense making, without purpose, without some sort of direction, It's difficult for teams and stakeholders to have a course. It's chaos. So in the midst of chaos, you need to have a course, and you need to be able to hold on to that course. Issues and stakeholders need to be mapped and remapped again and again as the situation develops. Stakeholders, there are many. Not all of them will be immediately impacted by the crisis. Map them and obviously use whatever available channel is appropriate to manage with to engage with these stakeholders, be it on social media, by phone call, personal visits, email, whatever it is. You need to use every channel that's available. Beware of crises, protracted crises that tend to cause a siege mentality. So stay out there. And of course, crisis is not over until it's really, really, really over. Sometimes the aftermath of the crisis is much worse than the actual crisis itself, and some of them linger for decades. Of course, the ultimate example of that is Bhopal in India. So here we are. We're close with this. I want to leave you with this thought. You can't control the events of a crisis, but you can certainly control how you choose to communicate and how you choose to be believed. So credibility you can control. And that is the fundamental underpinning of any crisis leadership training that needs to be provided to your senior teams. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Hi Caroline, it's Anne here from the BCI. So we've had the first question come through. Okay. How often crisis management teams meet and perform exercises?
The large organizations run large simulation exercise at least once a year with desktop exercises in between. I would say a frequency, depending on the size, risk, scope of the organization, of 6 months to 18 months is a good ratio. Anything longer than 18 months is not good enough.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question that's come in: what types of resources are effective for training your C-suite in crisis management? This could include webinars, books, anything like that.
I think C-suites are a demanding audience. They want senior people training them. Of course, books are great, and senior leaders do read a lot of books. I don't think that webinars and e-learnings are appropriate for C-suite, if perhaps only to reinforce certain things. I think the regular engaging dynamic sessions run by experts in the field that really can challenge the thinking and the status quo is the best way to go. So expert trainers in the field of crisis management and leadership is what is needed.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So we've got no other questions, so I think if we hold the line just for a minute or two to allow anyone else to type the questions that they have. I will just say we've had a couple of requests coming through for the slides. Okay. Caroline has requested that anyone that would like the presentation contacts her directly following the presentation.
That would be great.
Brilliant. So we've got another question in. What is the most successful crisis management exercise you have ever come across? Oh,
I've run many in my career of varying complexities and scope. I've run double shift hours live exercise with multiple installations that were absolutely really brought a lot of learning. I've run 3-day online simulations for the board of a company that migrated from Australia, Asia, into Europe, into America. That was incredible. Initially, in fact, we decided to do it this way because this team was always on the go, traveling, and it was very difficult to get them together in a room. In fact, today that is more and more of a challenge. So we opted for the online simulation format, and they were so engaged. They were working through the night, delegated to deputies when they were traveling, and to them it felt very, very real, even though it was still a simulation. And there was an incredible amount of learnings. But not every exercise needs to be that big in scope. You can run very successful desktop exercises. It's all about framing the objectives, framing the expectations and building something that is bespoke to the need of this organization, the team that's being trained, and the types of risks that they are facing.
Fantastic, thank you. We have time for a few more questions, so moving on. Caroline, what are some good resources for BC managers to increase their skills in crisis management?
E-learning is very good. We've developed a number of e-learning modules that different managers can take. Coaching, we also coach BC managers in crisis management, and we've done that several times. So coaching is good because a BC manager will have a fundamental understanding of certain paths, and the coaching approach to add the crisis component to it is a very effective one. Of course, attending crisis training, be they in-house or public, and there's a number of organizations that run very good crisis training sessions or programs. So attending those is very good because you can meet and share with other people in the field. So I would say any one of those three is very good.
Fantastic. So the next question that's come in, the presentation focused a lot on external stakeholders, but what would your advice be for managing internal stakeholders and staff?
I think that's an excellent question. Yes. Well, staff is primordial, but because I mean they're your ambassadors. They're, very often we wait until we have a better understanding of the crisis before we actually communicate to our staff. I think the sooner the better with employees is the order of the day. There are many cases where employees are communicated with too late. I would say that you also have to be very mindful of what is communicated internally. The famous memo that was sent by the United Airlines CEO after this poor doctor was dragged out of the aircraft was leaked. Of course, what did you expect? Internal stakeholders are important, but my feeling is that the bringing them on board needs to be done before the crisis. Not every department needs to be involved in the crisis response, but they need to be understanding what the principles are, what the governance is, and how they should react if they do have to get involved. So before is better. Some organizations are very complex, therefore there can be a lot of politics in that. So the more you do up front, the better.
Fantastic, thank you. So the next question to come in, how do you engage senior management as soon as you walk into a room?
I have 30 years of experience, and to be honest, I start very often by asking questions. I don't lecture people. I have my own way. We have at CS&A our own way to work with senior leaders, which is very different than middle managers. And the expectations are really high. Bringing in new components, new elements that they might not have thought of is a very good way to generate a wake-up call and to get everybody's attention very quickly. We follow a very interactive approach with where, for instance, slides are just a supporting component, and with a lot of engaging discussions going on.
Brilliant, thank you. So moving on, if a business is relocating their offices, what is the best exercise for the crisis management team to prepare for it?
Well, if you want to crisis exercise you want to generate a crisis exercise out of an office move, you need to think about the scenarios where the office move could cause chaos or may engender a number of problems. So the scenario for the office move is not the office move by itself. It's a negative consequence of something occurring during the office move or as a result of the office move. So the crisis exercise should be on a scenario, a crisis scenario that is a result of that move.
Fantastic. So we have time for just 2 more questions. So the next one, what is the approach to communicate with employees exposed to work in unsecure areas?
Straightforward, simple, exposing the potential exposure, giving them a clear but easy to follow set of actions or directions. Transparency, absolutely key. But you need to change the tone, perhaps, depending on what level of employees you're talking to. And of course, it needs to be in line with the level of exposure they might have.
Brilliant. So the last question to come in, Caroline. In the framework, you put the business continuity in the third phase. Why aren't you running it also during the emergency?
Business continuity should always be in the third phase. Business continuity plans are a operational tactical response to a critical risk that has been identified in the risk management phase. So it's first risk, then crisis plan needs to be there because any of these risks that materialize become a crisis. But for every critical risk that has been identified, a business continuity plan needs to be in place if the organization wants to continue to operate through the chaos, through the crisis. So business continuity is always last in the planning phase. It doesn't mean it can happen, the planning can happen concurrently, but the business continuity plans are a direct result of critical risks that have been identified.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So that question brings us to the end of the webinar. So on behalf of the BCI, we'd like to thank Caroline very much for her presentation. We'd also like to thank you all for participating in BCAW and obviously coming into these webinars. If you have any further questions for Caroline or you'd like her presentation, please feel free to drop her an email on the email address currently on screen. And yeah, have a lovely weekend, everybody.
Thank you very much all for attending. I hope this was useful. Have a nice weekend. Thanks, Anne, for facilitating this. And thank you. Goodbye.